Today we start a brand new series we're calling Insomnia, the lies that keep you up at night. Over the next few weeks, we're going to look at some of those doubts and fears that can linger in the back of our minds and cause sleepless nights. We all have certain doubts and fears that don't go away when it's time to go to bed, when the day settles down and there's no more TV or Facebook or work or school or even kids to distract you, and you're left alone with just your thoughts. They often drift into doubts and fears, and in the darkness, those doubts and fears grow. The premise of this series is that beyond these fears and doubts is a lie that we buy into. And we could eliminate the fear if we could replace that lie with a deeper truth. Today we want to look at just one fear, but it's a big one that many of us have carried around for most, if not all, of our life. The fear we're talking about today is the fear of rejection. The fear of rejection, as big as it is, still comes from a lie. The lie that I'm not good enough. I think it's common to all of us. Don't we ever pick ourselves apart, over-criticizing ourselves, thinking that we'll never measure up? That's the fear of rejection, and that's the lie talking. It can be really scary at times, can't it? I know it is for me, too, more often than I'd like to admit. Now, this fear of rejection actually shows itself in our lives, rearing its ugly head and hinting at its presence in three particular ways. The first way this fear plays out in our lives is the obvious way, when we fear rejection from other people. Someone else will tell us, either directly or indirectly, that you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not talented enough, or you're not anything enough. And we've all felt that rejection. Interestingly, many of our fears in our adult lives can be traced back to our childhood, and this one is no different. Just think about school alone and the rejections that we can experience there, right? Getting cut from the team, not making that part in the play, struggling to get passing grades, being backstabbed by so-called friends, or being turned down by your crush. These early disappointments are bitter ones, that's for sure. But it doesn't hurt less later on in life either. So much so that we fear the very possibility of experiencing it again. And as human beings, we long for approval. We need it and we crave it. And so when we don't get it, or when we're afraid we're not going to get it, it really hurts. The second way the fear of rejection affects us is through the fear of rejection from God. We're concerned that we don't, or maybe we just can't measure up to God's standards. Now, some of you may push back even though you're in a church today. You're not even sure if you believe in God. And if that's you, I want you to know that we're really glad you're here. Really, we want to be a church that is welcoming and accessible, no matter what you believe about God, if you believe in Him at all. But you don't have to be super religious to recognize that you're not perfect, which inevitably brings the lingering thought that God, if there is a God, might reject us if we don't measure up to His perfection, or if we don't meet His standards. In fact, I've met those who don't believe in God precisely because they believe that God does not believe in them. And that's an awful thought. But it's an understandable fear to have. The third way in which this fear affects you and me is the fear of rejection from ourselves. We all have regrets, times where we haven't measured up to our own standards. And if you're anything like me, you're so driven, you set such high standards for yourself that you struggle to live up to them. This is especially true for you perfectionists out there. I suspect that there might even be a couple of you hiding in the pews. Now, the bad news about this fear of rejection in any of these forms is that it leads to this constant comparison. If you find yourself constantly comparing yourself to others, that doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means you probably have the fear of rejection. The good news is that there's a clear antidote to this fear, and it's found in the gospel passage we heard today. There is a truth there that we can grasp, that we need to work from our head into our hearts. So we're going to take a look at this passage again, found in the 18th chapter of St. Luke, where we hear this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. Now, when we hear the word Pharisee, we tend to automatically assume this negative view of the character because they were the bad guy in the gospel, the total religious snobs, always giving Jesus a hard time. For us, the word Pharisee conjures up images of hypocrisy. But it's worthwhile noting that the people in Jesus' day wouldn't have heard it that way. The Pharisees were considered the most religious and righteous people of all. Many consider them to be the models for how God wanted people to live. On the other hand, tax collectors were universally despised, and some still are today. That was because they collected taxes for the Romans, which most would consider an act of treason. Besides that, most of these collectors were corrupt, swindling communities of vast sums annually and lining their pockets with money they had no right to. Jesus' listeners would have quite naturally assumed that the Pharisee would be the hero of the story and that the tax collector would be the villain, especially when they're going to the temple to pray. Jesus goes on. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of my income. To the crowd hearing this story, the Pharisee is, as expected, objectively the good guy. And we should all aspire to be like him in his actions. He doesn't cheat other people. He's honest with his work. He's loyal to his spouse. He fasts twice a week. And he even tithes. All of this is good. So he's doing pretty well, objectively. Then Jesus describes the tax collector's prayer. He says, but the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. While the Pharisee rambles on at length, the tax collector prays an entirely simple prayer. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. He throws himself upon God's mercy, acknowledging that on his own he is not sufficient, that he deserves to be rejected by God. His actions aren't enough to endear him to God. The whole crowd listening to the story would think Jesus' conclusion would sound like, be more like the Pharisee. But Jesus, on the other hand, ends the story like this. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. In other words, the tax collector left the temple good with God, but the Pharisee's prayer wasn't well received. Measured by human achievement and performance, the Pharisee wins, hands down. But to stop there is to live by the lie that we will never be enough. The truth is, we aren't accepted by God based on our performance or achievements. God accepts you not based on what you have done, but based on what he has done for you on the cross. That's so important. I'm going to say it again. God accepts you not based on what you have done, but based on what he has done for you on the cross. The tax collector went home in a right relationship with God because he sought acceptance based on God rather than on himself. The Pharisee, who prays to himself about himself, went home full of himself and acted as if he has no real need for God. The point of the parable and the answer for our fear of rejection is that we don't have to perform our way into a right relationship with God. We simply need to receive his love and his mercy with humility and to admit that we didn't achieve it by our own efforts. When we do perform good works, and we must if we are to grow as a Christ follower, we are free to do them out of love for God, to become more like him, not out of a need to earn his approval. In the person of Jesus Christ, and through his sacrifice on the cross, you are completely loved and accepted by God. Listen to these words carefully. In the person of Jesus Christ, and through his sacrifice on the cross, you are completely loved and accepted by God. God is the one who reigns forever. He's the king of the universe, the author of all life, of everything that is. And he calls you his friend. And if he accepts you and loves you, then there is no need to fear the rejection of others. If God has accepted us, then we need to accept ourselves. I need to trust what God has said about me, because he's God, after all. He would know. So we find that the antidote to fear is not courage, it's faith.